What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, I want to show you an incredible game played between Magnus Carlsen and Daniel Naroditsky on the chess.com servers in October 2024. And here we go. In the game, Magnus Carlsen opening 1e4 best by test, and Daniel does go 1c5 to Sicilian Defense. Then we have knight to f3, knight c6, and now instead of d4 or bishop e5, those are the main lines for white. Here, Magnus does go knight to c3, a very tricky sideline, and Daniel does go e5 in the spear of the Sveshnikov Sicilian. Now here we have bishop c4, the main line, d6, d3, and bishop e7. Now the idea behind going bishop e7 before knight to f6 here is by delaying it one more move, you do maintain control of that g5 square and stop bishop g5 ideas from white. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he has many different options. Lately, a lot of top players have been going either knight to d2 or h3 followed by knight to h2 before castling. But instead, in the game, Magnus, he does go short castles. That is the old main line. And here, black does go knight to f6. Now, in this position, white has many dangerous lines. The most dangerous, perhaps, is knight to g5, putting immediate pressure on that pawn on f7 in the spirit of the fried liver attack of the Italian game. Of course, black can castle and he is fine, but then you can go f4, getting a kingside attack going on the right side of the board. Now here, instead, in this position, Magnus is in a slower mood today. He does go a4, gaining space on the queen side and preemptively stopping b5 ideas from black. Of course, it wasn't a threat yet, but black may want to go a6, rook b8, and then b5. That's a very common idea in this line for black. Now here, Daniel, short castles on the board, and Magnus does go h3, controlling that g4 square, stopping knight g4 and bishop g4 ideas. Very solid move. And now Daniel does the same. h6 for him, guarding g5. Of course, knight g5 is always a big threat in this line, followed by f4 ideas. Therefore, h6 makes quite a bit of sense. Now Magnus, rook to e1, continuing to sort of slow play the game in the spirit of the Italian opening. And here Daniel, he has many different options. The strongest move, perhaps, is either rook b8 or a6, intending b5 after you get both those moves on the board. Now, instead, in the game, he plays a very solid move, bishop e6, in the spirit of the Italian opening, challenging that Italian-style bishop on c4 immediately. And now, very importantly, yes, white can capture on e6. Bishop takes e6 is a playable move for white. However, Magnus knows if you do that, black will recapture with the f-pawn, and that pawn on e6 controls both d5 and f5, and that would really block a lot of white's aggressive ideas in this position. Therefore, that would not be a good idea at all. In fact, it would be a major mistake. So with that in mind here, Magnus, he does not take on the e6, and he also does not allow the trade of that light square bishop, at least not yet. Instead, he jumps in with the knight to the very weak d5 square, knight d5, by far the strongest move in this position. All right, now, Daniel, what should he be doing here? Well, the truth is, if white wants that bishop pair, he will get it. For example, knight takes e7 is being threatened, and the only way to stop it is bishop takes d5. But again, either way, you're giving up either your light squared or your dark squared bishop. Now here, the best plan for black is just queen d7, staying very calm, and if white doesn't take on e7, then you just go bishop d8, again maintaining your bishop pair. But instead here, Daniel, he plays a much more active idea. Bishop takes d5, trading the bishop for the knight immediately. And now the idea being, if white recaptures with the bishop, then you go knight takes d5, eliminating white's bishop pair, and for that matter, the weak d5 square altogether, as white will have to recapture with the pawn, and that does eliminate that hole on d5. Now, very importantly here, Magnus, he does not recapture with the bishop. Instead, e takes d5 is the move, maintaining that bishop pair. And yes, right now the game is closed. However, later in the game, it could open up, and those bishops would be monster. Therefore, even though the game is temporarily closed, those bishops are a huge asset and do give white a small advantage. Now here, black, knight b4 is the move, the best placement for the knight. Now you are threatening knight b takes d5, and it's actually almost impossible to defend that pawn on d5. White is effectively giving black that pawn for free. So what is white's idea here? Well, here, Magnus, he finds by far the best move in this position, really the only good one. He jumps in with the knight to the h4 square. So knight to h4, intending knight to f5. That knight will be an absolute monster on f5. From there, white has ideas like, queen f3 to g3, even bishop takes h6 before queen g3 could be a move as a sacrifice. So here, that knight is going to spearhead the white attack on the king side. Now, Daniel, what should he be doing right here? Well, it turns out you don't have to capture on d5 immediately. After all, white has no good way to defend it. Instead, ideas like queen d7 or queen c8 guarding f5 could be a better option. But instead, knight b takes d5 was played in the game, capturing that pawn immediately. And of course, Magnus, he just jumps in with the knight to f5. Knight to f5. Again, that knight is an absolute monster. Garry Kasparov once said a knight on f5 is worth at least a pawn, and that is certainly true here. Very ironic. White is down a pawn, but that knight more than compensates for it. Now again, there are many ideas here like bishop takes h6 as a sacrifice, queen f3 to g3, and so on. Black is going to have to defend almost flawlessly here to stay in the game. All right, Daniel, in this position, he has many different defensive ideas. White is not technically threatening a sacrifice yet. For example, you can just go, say, king to h7, guarding the dark squares around the king side. Knight b4 is decent, even queen d7, pressuring the knight. But instead, in the game, Daniel, he does go knight c7. And this is a very interesting move. I did not expect this at all. His idea, perhaps, either supporting a b5 break or even better, intending knight to e6, transferring the knight over to the king side where it will be able to help a little more on the defense. All right, now, Magnus, in this position, he has a lot of different ideas. For example, you can actually sacrifice the bishop on h6 immediately. It turns out that is not only a playable move, it's actually quite strong. Now, shockingly, the top engine line says you want to go d4, giving up the pawn, and then after c takes d4, then you sack the bishop. So that is just how good White's position here is. Despite being down a pawn, there are just tons of sacrificial ideas in the air. Now instead in the game, Magnus, he plays a little slower idea. Rook to e3. A decent idea. The point being, he wants to go rook g3, getting the rook to g3, not the queen. And from there, of course, bishop takes and knight takes h6 would be threats, as that pawn on g7 would be pinned to the king on g8. It wouldn't be able to recapture on h6. Now here, Daniel, he does have a chance to punish this slow move by Magnus. For example, queen d7 would be very strong, hitting the knight. And of course, if White goes queen f3 defending it, then the rook lift doesn't make a whole lot of sense as it is blocking in the bishop, and that is the main drawback of this move. It does temporarily block in the bishop, and yes, if it moves, the bishop will open up once again, but for right now, it's blocked in, and there are temporarily no sacrificial ideas on h6. All right, here, Daniel, the best move again, queen d7, hitting the knight, but instead d5, a much more active idea, and this is where the game gets absolutely insane. All right, here, Magnus, he ignores the threat on his bishop. He actually swings his rook over, rook to g3, and now the point being, if you take that bishop, I'm going to take your pawn on g7, rook takes g7, maybe I can follow up, bishop takes h6, and so on, and things would get just completely insane. Now, shockingly, the computer says that is actually not the worst idea for Black. In fact, it is the strongest move here. But from a practical standpoint, that is an incredibly hard move to make during a blitz game. After all, in blitz, the initiative is everything. It is so much easier to attack than it is to defend. So with that in mind here, Daniel, he eschews that immediately. Instead, g6, a decent defensive move. Now, very importantly, that pawn on g6 is pinned to the king. It cannot move. And beyond that, it's actually a liability as White is threatening rook takes g6 right here. As soon as this diagonal opens up, if the bishop lives, then a rook takes g6 could be a threat as the pawn on f7 would be pinned to the king on g8. So overall, g6, I mean, that pawn itself is weak. h6 is now hanging. However, that is what he had to do in this position to defend. It's the only other good move besides d takes c4. Now here, Magnus, bishop a2, preserving that bishop, and king to h7, trying to defend. Now, of course, that pawn on g6 is not pinned. Therefore, g takes f5 is a real threat. And Magnus, what is he going to do about it? Well, it turns out you don't have to move the knight yet. For example, bishop takes h6 is a very serious move. Then if you take the knight, ideas like rook g7 and so on could be deadly. Instead, he plays a different idea, queen d2. Now, here the point is if you take that knight, then queen takes h6 would be checkmate on the spot. So obviously, Daniel, he cannot do that. Instead, in the game, he does jump back with his own knight, knight to g8, defending h6 with the knight, a very strong move. Now, very importantly, that pawn on h6 is still hanging. You have 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking versus the 1, 2 defending, and therefore with that in mind here, Magnus, instead of retreating, he does just immediately capture on h6. So knight takes h6 is the move, winning that free pawn. And now again, very importantly, you cannot take on h6 After queen takes, I mean, the attack is just too strong. Therefore, instead, here, Daniel, he shows the idea of knight to c7 earlier in the game. He does transfer it to e6, knight to e6, an excellent defensive move. He knows when you defend, you must bring all of your pieces into the defense. All right, now Magnus, knight takes g8, then king takes, and then he flies in with the queen. Queen to h6, an excellent move. Now he is threatening ideas like rook takes g6, potentially, maybe. We'll have to wait and see. All right, here, Daniel, how does he want to defend? Well, there are a lot of ideas. In the game, he finds a very creative one. Bishop to f6, sort of artificially fianchettoing his bishop, going bishop f6, potentially bishop g7, knocking back that queen on h6, and that bishop will do an excellent job of defending those dark squares on the king side. All right, now, Magnus, how should he proceed with the attack? Well, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Magnus right here in this position. And while you're at it, if you're enjoying this video, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, here, perhaps the most aggressive and strongest idea is pushing the alpha 0 h-pawn down the board, h4, threatening h5. Now, the idea behind this, of course, that pawn is poisoned. You simply cannot take it. If you take that pawn, say, bishop takes h4, then the move is going to be rook to h3. The bishop is pinned. If it moves back to f6, queen h7 would be checkmate on the spot. And if you don't move it, g3 will hit the bishop. And of course, it is still pinned. So that would be a disaster. And if you don't take the pawn, then h5 is a threat, threatening h takes g6 and so on. Now, instead in the game, c3 was the move by Magnus, a decent move, stopping knight d4 ideas, controlling d4. Not bad at all, just not as active. Now, Daniel, again, he has many ideas. I would have expected to say bishop g7, but instead he does go knight to g7. A very interesting plot twist here. Fianchettoing the knight on g7 instead of the bishop. And now that bishop on f6 could be vulnerable later in the game. All right, Magnus, rook to f3, pressuring the bishop. Excellent move. Now the queen is restricted where it can go. It can't go to, say, d7 as the bishop would hang. Now, here, Daniel. He's not in a rush, he's not in a hurry, and he can just kind of slow play this and defend. For example, rook d8 is fine, knight f5 is fine, and so on. But instead here, he does hurry. He plays the move e4, gaining space in the center. Very active, very aggressive, but not necessarily good. As you can see by the eval bar on the left side of your screen, skyrocketing up. This turns out to be a very serious mistake in this position. Here, Magnus, he just goes full beast mode in this game. D takes e4, then d takes, and then rook to e3, pressuring that pawn on e4, an excellent move. Now here, Daniel, he spots a very simple tactic, bishop g5, hitting the queen on a6 and the rook on e3. That'd be a very deadly fork, and he plays it in a heartbeat, bishop g5. However, unfortunately, this turns out to be a critical mistake. Instead, you simply had to fly in with the queen, queen d1, hitting the king right away, and pinning that bishop on c1 to the rook on the a1 square. Now here, Magnus, his queen on h6 is being attacked by the bishop. You can't go queen takes g5 as the queen on d8 does still defend. But Magnus, being the GOAT, he finds the only move in this position to save the queen. That is the move queen takes g6, and the bishop on a2 pins the pawn on s7 to the king on g8. F takes g6 is not a legal move, as again, the king would be under check by that bishop on a2. So excellent move by Magnus here. All right, Daniel. He does not take that rook on e3. Instead, he finally flies in with the queen, queen d1, hits the king, king to h2, and then he takes on e3. Now here, the threat is bishop takes c1. He would be up a full piece if he gets that in. But here, Magnus, he calculates everything out. He knows you can actually capture the bishop on e3 despite the pin on the rook on the a1 square. So, bishop takes e3 is the move with the discovered attack on the queen. Now, what's the idea? If you take the rook on a1, queen takes, then bishop h6 will be game over on the spot. There is no way to defend the knight on g7, and of course it is pinned, therefore it cannot move. That would be checkmate instantly. So here, Daniel, he cannot take it. Instead, the move is queen to h5, flying back with the queen, an excellent move, offering the queen trade, and here Magnus is oh too happy to go into a winning endgame, or potentially winning. Queen takes, then knight takes is the sequence, and now both sides have less than 1 minute left on the clock, and it may look roughly level. I mean, White may have a small advantage, you may say, thanks to his extra pawn, but the real asset here is those two bishops The dark square and light squared bishop are just so incredibly strong here. And the overall material is technically level. Black has the 2 rooks. White has the 1 rook and the 2 minor pieces for the 2 rooks. Now, real fast, let's slow down and do inventory in this endgame. Both sides have less than 1 minute left on the clock. Therefore, the clock will be a major factor in the game. Beyond that, meat material is technically about level. White has an extra pawn, but black does have the extra exchange, that being the rook for the bishop. However, very importantly here, white does have that bishop pair in an open position, and those bishops here are just absolute monsters. They're going to be slicing through the board, and for that reason, the computer does give white a massive advantage. So let's see if Magnus can make full use of those bishops in this game. He starts bishop takes c5, winning that pawn, hitting the rook on f8. The rook must move, rook f to e8, but now bishop d5. And again, we are seeing the strength of those bishops. If you go b6 try to defend, the rook on a8 will hang. Therefore, Daniel, rook a to d8, hits the bishop, but now bishop takes b7, wins yet another pawn, and maintains the attack on that pawn on e4. All right, Daniel, rook b8, then bishop to c6 hits the other rook. Now here, the bishops are lined up. You can go rook to c8. That is what Daniel does. But now, very importantly, bishop takes a7, winning the free pawn. And if you take the bishop, Magnus takes your rook on b8. Therefore, the bishops, seemingly, they will live. And very importantly, ideas like rook b7 or rook a8 hitting the other bishop don't work, as the bishop still controls b7. Now, rook takes b2, the only good move for Daniel, winning the free pawn. And now bishop takes e4, winning the other pawn. Now here, Magnus, he has temporarily 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns versus the 1 pawn of Daniel. Of course, Daniel will likely win back at least 1, but here, Magnus, his material advantage is just growing and growing. All right, knight to f6 is the move, jumping back with the knight and pressuring that bishop on e4. Now, bishop f3, knight d7, and bishop d4. Now the bishop does defend the pawn on c3. That bishop is perfectly placed, and there's very little stopping this pawn on the a file from marching down the board. All right, both sides still in time pressure. Anything can happen. We have knight to c5, then a5, knight b3, rook to a3, getting out of the attack. Knight takes d4 and c takes d4. So Daniel Naroditsky getting rid of white's bishop pair in this game. Excellent idea. But now white is still up 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns in this position. And that is worth way more than the extra exchange or the extra rook for the bishop for black. All right, rook c7, defending along the 7th rank. But now a6, the alpha 0 a pawn marching down the board. Rook to a7, then king g3, rook b4, and then d5, the other pawn in the game as well. All right, now we have rook to b6 trying to defend. Bishop b2 defends the pawn on a6 and frees up the rook on a3 to move somewhere else. Now we have king to f8, king f4, king e7, king e5, and then f6 hits the king. Now king d4, king d6, rook c3, threatening ideas like potentially even rook c6, trading off some pieces, knowing the endgame would be winning with those extra pawns on the king side. All right, now Daniel, rook b4 is the king, but then rook c4 offering the trade, and here Daniel does go for it, shockingly. Rook takes, then bishop takes, recapturing with the bishop, and now the bishop very well placed, defending those pawns on d5 and a6. All right, now rook to e7, then h4, the h pawn now marches down the board, rook to e1 and h5, go h pawn, go. All right, rook d1, bishop d3, blocking the check, rook h1, then g4, defends the pawn with the g pawn. Now, rook g1, f3, Magnus, all of his pawns defending each other perfectly. How pretty is that? Now, rook to h1, king d4, rook e1, king f5, king e7, bishop e4. Now, the bishop is officially a giant pawn, but it doesn't matter. Magnus is too far ahead. Rook a1, d6 hits the king. If the king moves, then the pawn on f6 does fall as well, and these pawns will just be uncontested marching down the board. All right, king to f7, bishop d5 hits the king once again, king e8, and now h6. The alpha 0 pawn again. Can Daniel possibly stop it? Well, he's going to try. Rook h1, then the other pawn, a7, and the bishop does control a8. This is getting ugly. All right, king d7. Daniel fights on with 3 seconds left on the clock. a8 gets a new queen, rook c1, and then simply exchanging the queen and the rook is queen to c6. Now we have rook takes, bishop takes, and then king takes f6, king c7, h7, king d6, h8 promotes to a queen. Daniel having 1 second left. He is playing on. What a fighter. All right, king c7, queen e8, king d6, queen to e5, king takes c6, and now g6. And here finally Daniel, he doesn't even resign. He just loses on time, as you can see by the timer on your screen there. All right, wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and Daniel Naroditsky. This one was a fun one. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where Daniel gets his revenge on Magnus and plays an absolutely brilliant blitz game. I mean, that game was just unbelievable, crazy attack in chess. If you enjoyed this one, check that one out as well, and I will see you in the next video.